What's up, everybody? Welcome to Make Things Tiny. My name is Mick, and today is all about sustainability. I'm talking to Desiree. Desiree is the owner of Simply Sustainable, a building science consulting firm. They're going to talk about their experiences with tiny houses. They're also building a tiny house right now as well, so you're going to learn a lot from them. You'll learn about tiny houses in general and sustainability. And for those of you who are interested in building your own tiny house and learning more about sustainability in that process, this is a really great video for you. So if you're new to the channel, please do take time to subscribe. It helps me out a ton. Just tap that subscribe button down at the bottom of your screen. Helps me grow the community. Helps me continue to do all of these fantastic videos and continue to do what I love, which is talk to you all about tiny houses. Tap that notification bell so you find out when I drop new videos. I drop new videos every single week. All right, let's jump into this. Let's talk about tiny houses and sustainability. So I'm here today with Desiree. Desiree, thank you so much for being on the channel. Desiree owns a company, a consulting firm, a building science consulting firm called Simply Sustainable. If you wouldn't mind just taking a few minutes to talk a little bit about your background, like what got you interested in tiny homes, and we'll just go from there.
Sure. Um, so I guess I'll start by just giving you a little bit about my business. So the Simply Sustainable Building Science Consulting Firm. I help people with their homes. Um, I do like building performance, energy audits, energy code testing, a lot for new construction. Um, and as a part of that work, I do education, building science education with the public, but also with Yestermorrow, the school in Vermont, and teach tiny house design there. Really, my work that I do is spawns from a passion on about helping people live more sustainably and making sustainable living, simple living, um, more approachable and attainable for as many people as possible. Um, and that is kind of how I got into tiny homes. I lived in New York City um, for about 10 years, and I'd say probably about in 2012, I found out about tiny homes um, through YouTube, and kind of like many people went down the YouTube rabbit hole. And I think the biggest thing that I learned um, in that rabbit hole was just how simple one can really live. And for me, I think tiny homes are an example, a metaphor, a methodology, really an exercise in learning how to live more simply and more sustainably. Um, and that passion for tiny houses really made me want to build my own. And that was before I'd ever lived in anything like a tiny house on wheels. I had lived in tiny apartments in New York City for years. Um, but even that seemed um, not so much the exact model that I wanted to live when I think about simple, sustainable living. I mean, to live in New York City is extremely expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And I found myself doing work that didn't really mesh with the life that I wanted to create for myself. And so I wanted a little bit more freedom. Um, After I lost a really good friend of mine in 2014, um, I kind of was inspired to go ahead and jump off the cliff and um, really make the life that I wanted for myself a reality. So I, packed up a backpack, sublet my apartment and in New York City and went traveling in Asia and Europe for 6 months um, the first time, and then the second time it was 2 months. And I lived in tiny houses all over the place. I lived on the side of a mountain. I lived in a rice paddy. I lived in the Spanish countryside. I lived in a forest in India. Um, and, that particular forest was actually reforested. It went from being a desert to being a forest because of the dedication of people who believed in, you know, not participating in capitalism and trying to create a world that they wanted and they didn't see existing at that moment in that desert. So for me, that experience of traveling around the world and experiencing tiny homes in different areas really gave me a taste of what it would be like to create my own little piece of the world. Um, um, Not just in terms of, the home that I wanted to live in, but the kind of work that I did, the way that I engage with my community, and the way that I share what I've learned with others. Um, so that's, a little bit of my background with tiny homes and why I think they're so important to me and so important to um, the work that I do now.
Mhm. I think that makes sense. I think your story sort of um, is similar to other people's stories where tiny houses sort of create an opportunity to live the life you actually want to. I
Hmm.
think when you said like you were doing work that really wasn't satisfying or didn't align with sort of like your values and what you wanted to do, I think we don't really have a lot of options in our culture today to really truly downsize without getting rid of almost everything, right? Like you have to kind of start over because it is so high. It's so expensive to live in most cities in the U.S., but especially in New York.
Hmm.
So I guess you could have had like a 300 square foot micro house loft in New York City that costs you a lot of money, or you could get a tiny house that saves you money. And I think that's really cool that you ended up traveling and staying in so many different tiny houses and just gaining perspective at each one. I don't think that's an experience that most people have where they can just travel and experience living in tiny houses in different places because the culture is different, the approach to living their life is different. So even if you have a tiny house here, it's not necessarily going to be the same experience as someone living in Asia or something like somewhere like that. So I think that's a really great sort of like part of your story too, and it meshes with what you do with your company as well. What made you decide to? Because I know that you're, building your own tiny house. What made you decide to sort of like settle, I guess, if you will, after all the traveling and create your own tiny space?
Um, I think, I mentioned earlier that a really close friend of mine passed away. She passed
Mhm.
away very suddenly at the age of 35, and she was an amazingly brilliant woman. She was um, assistant general counsel at a hedge fund. She read hundreds of books every year. She was like one of the kindest, sweetest people you'd ever meet. She would, meet someone once and then make them a homemade cake just because, they said they mentioned it, in a, passing in a conversation. Um, and I think, you know, experiencing that loss really made me think differently about my approach to life.
Mhm.
I no longer was satisfied with the thought of like working for 40 years
Right.
and trying to retire at some old age because who's to say that I would ever make it there.
Mhm.
um, and so um, for me, I think that experience of traveling was important to get perspective on different ways that other people across the world live their lives. Like, what kind of work are people um, investing their labor in? What kind of families? What kind of communities? What kind of approaches to building homes? Um, when I was in India, I stayed at this place called Auroville, and it is a community made up of people from all over the world. And you know, people who go and live there full time are people who agree to like no longer um, participate in capitalistic endeavors, but they work together to build homes for each member of the community that you don't have to pay rent for, but they're
Mhm.
yours for as long as you live there. And so there are all these different models and styles of building homes, whether they're building homes out of clay or wood or um, found objects. Um, and these homes come in all different shapes and sizes. So that in itself was an experiment and an experience that really stretched my mind and stretched um, what I saw was possible. Um, but life on the road, is hard to be so far away from the people that you love. So like
Mhm.
ultimately I came back and settled because I wanted to be closer to the people that I love. My parents, my siblings, nieces and nephews, friends, um, who have always, just been supportive. It's hard when you're on the other side of the world for a long period of time. So ultimately I wanted to have a space that could be mine, um, affordably, that, I didn't have to worry about taking out a mortgage for, um, and that no matter where I went, I could always come back to this place. I wanted it to be a place of peace, of like restoration, so that friends and family, when they needed to take a break from life, could come and have a space, whether that's in my home or, um, in another tiny home. I want to be, um, a person, and I want to have a place that is always available for people in need.
Mhm.
So
That makes
that's
sense.
kind of what made me decide to settle.
Mhm.
I didn't feel
Yeah.
like I could have all of that on the road. So
Yeah, of course. No, definitely. And it's great that you found a place that you're happy with and you're building your tiny house and you're getting that chance to sort of put everything together between, your work and your experiences and all your travels and just sort of like put it all together into a project that is like perfect for you. I think that's wonderful. I think that's ideal. Do you have like any sort of like design elements in mind, like things that you like some of like your must-haves in the build, or is it pretty like simple? Because I know you talk about like sort of like simple living, but is there anything you're like, I gotta have a dishwasher, or I need to have my,
you know, it's
stackable washer and dryer?
it's funny because this process has taken way longer than I thought, and I feel
Hmm.
like um, that's been okay. When I first started this process, I was like, I need to have a heated driveway because I don't want to have to, do any shoveling, and I need to have this and I need to have that. But actually, as time has gone on, I have felt less and less that those kinds of things are needed.
Hmm.
Um, and the more that I have gone through the process of cutting down trees, milling wood, framing out the building, learning about every aspect of a build from electrical to plumbing to siding to furniture to when you realize all of the different parts that actually go into building a home,
Hmm.
you also realize um, what really is important to make living in that home special.
Right.
And heated driveways is not one of those things.
It sounds nice though. It does sound nice.
Yeah, it's also like, super unneeded. Like my street gets plowed pretty much immediately. Um, and if you park at the end of the driveway, you really only have to shovel out around the car.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I have not been in a situation where there was so much snow where, I felt like I was going to be stuck. Usually you can shovel what needs to be shoveled by hand in an hour or two. And if I don't have the ability to like shovel for an hour or two
Hmm.
over the course of a day or 2 days, then I need to be in better shape.
That's fair. That's a good point.
Or have a friend that can help me. So
Right.
if I'm either not in good shape or don't have a friend that can help me, then I have other problems. You
Yeah.
know?
Hmm.
I have other problems. So
As someone who's like building, since you're building your own tiny house, like, what are your thoughts on like, what are the kind of like pros and cons, would you say, for like owning the land as a tiny home, like someone who's building their tiny house versus like renting the land or maybe like putting it in a community?
well, owning the land is an adventure. As you can see behind me, all those trees and people,
There's a
like
lot of
it
trees.
wasn't until I owned a piece of property that I realized that trees are not only beautiful, but they're dangerous and they're a liability.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they're amazing examples of what it is to like live and grow and go through that cycle of life. So I definitely do not regret purchasing the land, but I feel like what I learned by doing that is not what I expected to learn. And so people who um are, I don't know, who have problems letting go of control, um, may have an issue if they go and buy a wild, abandoned piece of property.
Mm.
Um, if you want to, go the simple route and buy something that's already like connected to services or that is already, um, all the trees have already been dealt with and you just want to have grass, then you know do that. um, I, on the other hand, have learned so much about the value of not cutting down trees, or of letting the land be the land and trying not to disturb it as much as possible. Um, like, we have a real soil crisis in this country,
Yeah.
and um, when you have soil that is not rich with nutrients, then you have food that's not rich with nutrients. You have, bacteria and species and all kinds of natural processes that are no longer available to anyone on the food chain. And so the idea of, you know, getting a piece of property and removing all of, you know, the natural um ecosystems that are there is it's it doesn't sound like very sustainable. Let me just
Hmm.
put it that way.
Yeah. No,
So,
that makes sense. That's a good point.
um, yeah,
Yeah.
like I do think that being a good steward of land is important.
Mm. Well, that's a kind of like a good segue into my other question, which is also the last question I have for you. What advice would you have for someone who wants to go tiny and they want to create a tiny house, but they want to do it with sustainability in mind? This isn't something that we really talk too much about. I think we talk about sustainability kind of broadly, but with your sort of like experience and your expertise, what would you say are some of the key things they would need to know to sort of go about creating a tiny house for themselves in a way that is sustainable?
I would say one of the best things you can do is to find a community of people, um, whether it is something that is established, an established community,
Mm-hmm.
or if it's, individual groups or individual people that you kind of collect for yourself that are of the same mindset. Um, to have people to bounce things off of, to learn from, that's really important. For me, it's been so wonderful um, to be able to teach at Yestermorrow. Um, you know, the tiny house design course that I co-teach is an amazing place for people to um, really engage with people who have experience and people who are learning about tiny houses, how to go about designing it, how to go about starting to think about the build process. Also, I have been a founding member of an organization called HVAC, which is the Hudson Valley Air Quality Coalition, and we talk a lot about um, air quality. What a lot of people don't realize when they're building homes is, how the materials that you choose to build your home with can affect your air quality, not
Mm-hmm.
just in the beginning of the build, but for years to come. And so it's been really great for me to be a part of that coalition, to learn from others, to teach people what I know from a building science perspective, um, and to be able to work with like Bard College on air quality research. Um, for me, sustainability is something that um, is in so many different parts of our lives, that to think about trying to do something like build a tiny house sustainably and trying to do that on your own, it's a big challenge because there's a lot, like basically everything that you would have to do to build a tiny house, you would have to not only learn how to do that thing, but also do it sustainably.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no more sustainable way to do that than in community or in partnership. Um, so, like, for me personally, um, I did in the past do coaching with people around like small business development. And, for the future, I am looking towards doing more kind of one on one kind of coaching, mentoring around that sustainability part, because I think um, it is something that's extremely difficult to do if you don't know someone who's um, has some experience in doing it.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I think like working with other people too, you can learn from them and like maybe you can help them later on down the line. And there are a lot more resources around tiny houses in general and building them and then also sustainability. So just taking the time to read those first before you get into it. So you know exactly how it's going to affect your overall design and your
Right.
budget and things like that too. I think that
Yeah.
that's really great advice to give someone, especially with, I think people have sustainability in mind more than maybe they have in the past. So I think that's a really good advice to give someone who is sort of in the early stages, but really wants to make sure that they make a good impact on the environment when they're going tiny.
Yep.
Yeah,
And
awesome.
also
Well,
just, sustainability in terms of your own personal lifestyle.
mhm,
Um, like your own personal energy,
yeah,
resources, all kinds of things. I think often when people think sustainability, they think about it in a environmental way, and that's part of it. But also as a human being, like what is sustainable for your energy level, for your emotional well-being, for your um, your general lifestyle.
mhm. No, I agree. I think that that's really important that it all sort of aligns. So it's not just like, oh, this is a really sustainable build, but I'm not really doing anything outside of just building this thing. So I think that that's a good point too, to just kind of, which I think the tiny house movement does kind of force you to do, is just sort of like look inward, reassess your values, and then make a change in your life based on
Yep.
that. So yeah, I agree with that. That's a good one. Good point too. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking time to chat with me. Like, I think that everything that you've sort of done is sort of culminating in what you're doing now with your build and, you're still teaching and all those things like that. So there'll be links to everything that you're doing in the description for the video. So hopefully people will reach out to you if they have questions, especially if someone's in the early stages and just wants to ask you questions about like, how do I build this in this sort of like helpful way, sustainable way.
Mhm.
So I'm excited for people to watch and to learn from you, and I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me too, because I feel like I learned a lot today as well, so thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much for asking me to be a part of this.
Yeah, of course, we'll talk soon.
All right.
All right, that was my conversation with Desiree. I really appreciate Desiree taking the time to talk to us about their company and just sort of like building science in general, their travels, all of their experience traveling and going to different tiny houses all around the world, and all this perspective that they gained from doing that, and then also their experience with building their tiny house now and owning their land too. So for those of you who are interested in learning more, please do reach out to Desiree. There's a link to their company and their website. You can reach out to them and everything that they're doing, as well as their school that they're teaching at as well. So please do reach out to them so you can find out more about how to build your own tiny house and build it sustainably. For those of you who are new to the channel, again, please take the time to subscribe. It helps me out a ton. Tap that notification bell so you can find out when I drop new videos. I drop new videos every single week. And as always, thank you so much for watching. We've got some really great content coming up in the future, more tiny house communities, more people in tiny homes, and then just also different topics. So let me know what you want to see. Drop a comment on this video. Let me know what you want to learn more about. And as always, don't forget to think tiny. Thanks, guys.